The movie starts with a wealthy accountant relaxing at home. Out of nowhere, a few Russian mafia members show up and force him to go with them to a secret location. They finally get to their destination, which is the accountant's office. Malenkov, the leader of the Russian mafia, has taken some office workers hostage because he thinks the accountant stole his money. The accountant is forced to open the safe in his boss's office, but when they open it, it's empty. Malenkov is furious and takes his anger out on the accountant. The next scene introduces Bryan Mills, the main character. One morning he visits his daughter, Kim, who's studying at a top university. Now Bryan shows up with a birthday gift for his daughter, but Kim seems nervous because she just found out she's pregnant and doesn't have the courage to tell her dad. Bryan decides to leave when Kim's boyfriend shows up. He already knows the guy and thinks of him as part of the family. That night, Bryan and Lenore have dinner and talk about Kim's future. But this time, Lenore opens up about her marriage problems with her new husband, which are falling apart. For the past 2 years, Lenore and her husband have been arguing a lot, and now she's ready to file for divorce. Deep down, she still has feelings for Bryan, but he keeps his distance because she's still married.
Town in a couple of days for a month on a job.
A few days later, Kim asks her dad to meet up. At first, she wants to talk about her pregnancy, but before she can say anything, she gets too nervous and changes the subject. Instead, she asks if she can adopt a puppy. Bryan's answer makes it clear how he feels about her decision if she decides to go through with the pregnancy. That night, Stuart, Lenore's husband, unexpectedly comes to Bryan to talk about something important. While he's there, he spots Lenore's scarf on the couch, which makes him suspect that she's been with Bryan. Without missing a beat, Stuart warns Bryan to keep his distance from Lenore for a while. The next day after finishing his jog, Bryan gets a message from Lenore. She says she wants to come over to talk about something important. At first, Bryan is hesitant, but he eventually agrees because it seems like Lenore really needs his help. Before Lenore shows up, Bryan quickly steps out to buy some bread, but when he gets back, he finds a knife on the floor and Lenore is already lying there, looking helpless. Soon after, 2 cops show up and immediately see Bryan as the main suspect. When they won't listen to his explanation, Bryan decides to run. More cops show up pretty quickly because of how serious the situation is. This is where Bryan's skills really kick in. He's always ready for emergencies and has escape plans no one expects. Bryan runs to a warehouse and quickly escapes through a water drain he had planned out earlier. After getting out of the water drain, Bryan quickly looks for a payphone to tell his daughter what happened to Lenore. When she hears the terrible news, Kim breaks down in tears, but Bryan promises to find whoever is responsible for Lenore's death. At the same time, Sergeant Frank, head of the city police, arrives at the scene. The case catches his attention because it's so unusual. Frank gathers a bunch of evidence, including Bryan's and Lenore's phones, and even the warm bread left on the table. From this, he gets the feeling that something isn't right. But despite all the weird details, Bryan is still the main suspect. Bryan and his friends have a secret hideout built for emergencies, and they can use it anytime they need. Inside, they've got all kinds of supplies, like weapons, clothes, cash, and other stuff they might need in a crisis. At the same time, Sergeant Frank figures out how Bryan managed to escape the police. This shows Frank isn't just any detective, he's got sharp skills, and the more he digs into the case, the more interested he gets, especially since it's full of tricky puzzles. While getting information at Stuart's house, Sergeant Frank meets Kim. She confidently tells Frank that there's no way her dad could be involved in this terrible situation.
Don't!
Stuart then tells Frank how Bryan managed to take down the Paris mafia that kidnapped his daughter a few years ago. It seems like Stuart is hinting that Lenore's death could be connected to Bryan's old enemies coming back for revenge. To figure out the mystery behind the case, the police try to access the GPS data from Lenore's and Bryan's cars, but before they can get the car to headquarters, Bryan makes a quick and risky move. It's a high-stakes decision, since the area is packed with law enforcement. After checking the GPS data from Lenore's car, Bryan finds some important info. It turns out that before everything happened, Lenore stopped at a gas station just outside of town. Even though he's unsure, Bryan decides to check out what his ex-wife did at the gas station. He pretends to be a cop and manages to convince the owner to show him the CCTV footage. Things get complicated when 2 cops suddenly show up at the gas station. While questioning the employees, they quickly find out Bryan is in the back room watching the CCTV footage. Instead of running, Bryan focuses on the footage. He sees that Lenore was probably lured there and taken by a group of mafia guys. Right before they spot him, Bryan catches a glimpse of a tattoo on one of their arms. On the way, Sergeant Frank warns his team to stay sharp. He knows Bryan's got serious skills and won't be easy to catch, but even though he's trying to help, the others think Frank is just being too careful. Bryan breaks out of his handcuffs and takes over the police car. Meanwhile, other cops try to stop him, but one by one their cars crash because of Bryan's wild driving. From the start, Bryan planned to grab a police car so he could access the database. He realizes the cops already have all the data from Lenore's phone, which she left in her apartment the day before. Because of this, Bryan tracks down who set him up to go to the gas station that night. But his moves trigger a citywide search, and soon cops surround him from all sides. Plus, they can easily track the car he's driving. In the end, Bryan goes for a crazy escape. He drives the car straight into an elevator. Right after the explosion, Bryan calls Frank using the phone of the detective who caught him earlier. During their chat, Bryan begs for 2 days to prove he's innocent, but Frank flat out refuses without a second thought. Frank thinks there's a hidden reason behind why Bryan let himself get caught. He suspects Bryan is planning to drop a crucial hint using the CCTV footage from the gas station. When Bryan reaches the secret hideout, he finds Sam ready to help him crack the case. But Bryan has one big ask. He wants to go to Lenore's funeral. The problem is the place is packed with police, all set up with surveillance gear around the area. In this moment, Sam's skills are really put to the test. He quietly manages to block all the police signals, letting Kim talk to her dad through a small camera hidden in her clothes. Sam also passes along Bryan's message, telling her to keep things normal and stick to her daily routine without drawing any suspicion. The next day, Kim starts feeling suspicious of her stepdad, who suddenly brings in a bunch of bodyguards. Since their house is already packed with police, his actions seem really weird. Before going to campus, Kim swings by a store to grab her favorite yogurt. While she's there, she finds a secret message from her dad. During her class, Kim suddenly feels sick and quickly asks to go to the restroom. When she gets in there, Bryan pops up out of nowhere. It turns out the yogurt she ate was mixed with anti-nausea meds. Bryan avoids leaving a direct message to keep the police from getting suspicious since they've been tailing Kim everywhere. He even finds a listening device hidden in Kim's clothes. But Frank is just as sharp. He suspected Bryan's moves from the start. Frank even checks out the store Kim went to before and finds the hidden message in the yogurt shell. Bryan shows up wanting to comfort his daughter, who looks really shaken by her mom's death. But things take a big turn when Kim drops the bomb that she's pregnant. Now Kim steps up to reassure her dad after dropping the shocking news. Even with everything going on, Bryan feels a bit relieved that Kim is being honest with him. She also mentions that her stepdad has been acting really weird lately. Not long after, Frank and his team roll up to catch Bryan. They move quickly, but when they check the bathroom, it's just only Kim. Bryan had already slipped away before they could do anything. The police quickly chase after Bryan, but he's planned all this well. He uses explosives to set off the emergency alarm, which draws a huge crowd. In all the chaos, Bryan takes his chance to get away, leaving the police swamped. Frank gets more and more frustrated as Bryan keeps dodging capture. Out of desperation, he starts putting pressure on Kim, thinking she's hiding her dad's whereabouts, but even with all the pressure, Kim stays calm and doesn't show any fear. That afternoon, Stuart gets ready to head to his secret hideout, carrying a bag stuffed with cash. After getting a tip from Kim, Bryan quietly follows him. But on the way, a car from the Russian mafia crashes into Bryan's ride, sending it tumbling down a hill. The mafia then tosses explosives into his car, leading to a huge explosion. Weirdly enough, not long after the mafia takes off, Bryan shows up unscathed. Bryan then hops into a passing car and keeps chasing after the mafia that hit him. The mafia gathers in a shop, ready to celebrate their win. But Bryan finds them, and a confrontation breaks out. Even though he's slowed down by his age, Bryan manages to take control of the situation. Unfortunately, just as one of the mafia members was about to spill who was behind everything, he took his own life rather than expose his boss. Bryan then drove to Stewart's hideout in a car that belonged to the Russian mafia. Oddly enough, when he got there, no one stopped him from coming in, which hinted that Stewart had some connections with the mafia. When Stewart came to, he realized his hands and feet were tied up tight. Bryan, eager to get to the bottom of things, started grilling him with his usual CIA tactics. Under all that pressure, Stewart finally spilled everything, unable to handle the mental and physical strain. Stewart confessed that he owed a huge debt to the Russian mafia. Lenore was targeted because Stewart tried to dodge his responsibilities. Malenkov, the head of the Russian mafia, was worried that Bryan would come after him, especially after Stewart mentioned Bryan's past as a top-notch operative. This made them plan to have Bryan caught by the police. Now the danger was even bigger since Kim was also in real trouble. With associates' help, Bryan quickly made his way to Stewart's place to rescue Kim. Even though there were several police officers and bodyguards hanging around, Bryan and his team didn't see it as a big deal. They were pros at handling situations like this.
Let's go, Kim.
Frank soon caught wind of the news, which got him to dig into Bryan's associates' backgrounds. He found out that they were all recruited by a special military unit when they were young, but their records were wrapped in mystery and hard for the police to get. This made Frank more and more sure that Bryan and his crew were former CIA agents. He also started thinking that Bryan wasn't to blame for Lenore's death. Meanwhile, Stewart started to spill the beans on Malenkov's real identity. Malenkov was a former Russian special agent who had been into all sorts of criminal activities since he was young. Eventually, he climbed to the top of the criminal world, becoming one of the biggest mafia bosses in the city. Actually, Stewart and Malenkov were business partners, and they made quite a bit of money together. But a few months back, their business hit a huge snag, resulting in big financial losses. Stewart was told to call Malenkov and fake a meeting, acting like he was planning to pay back his debt to the mafia.
Meet me at the building downtown. In 1 hour.
Getting to Malenkov wasn't easy. Every guest wanting to go upstairs had to go through a full inspection by 2 guards. After confirming their identity, the guards would signal the elevator operator on the upper floor, but the challenges didn't stop there. Once they reached the upper floor, they faced even more security. Still, for Bryan and his team, this was just another day at the office. They'd handled way tougher and riskier missions before. But just before Stewart and his crew could make their move, a call from the police interrupted them. Frank, thinking that Bryan was linked to Kim's disappearance, secretly had his men trace Stewart's phone signal. Once they found it, the police quickly headed to the hideout. The guards cleared Stewart, letting him go upstairs. But halfway up, Bryan snuck in from behind and quickly took Stewart's spot. Meanwhile, Stewart was told to head back to the truck and wait.
Get back to the truck.
The guards upstairs were already on high alert, but Bryan quickly took them down. Still, he had a bunch of other guards to get past before he could continue with his mission. Bryan finally got to the room where Malenkov was waiting with his surprise attack plan. The moment Bryan opened the penthouse door, conflict was unavoidable. He was immediately bombarded with gunfire, making it hard for him to move. When Malenkov ran out of ammo, he decided to face Bryan directly, noticing that Bryan was down and looked defenseless. But at the last moment, Bryan found his footing and launched an unexpected counter. In the last moments, Malenkov dropped a bombshell. He had never meant to target Bryan or his daughter. This was all part of Stewart's sneaky plan, as he'd played both of them for his own gain. At first, Stewart was deep in debt to the mafia and couldn't pay it back. In a desperate move, he made a risky deal. He asked the mafia to help him get rid of his wife so he could cash in on a big life insurance policy. He thought that the money would be enough to clear his debt. But after the insurance payout, Stewart didn't keep his end of the deal with the mafia, making everything even messier. Kim eventually found out her stepdad was lying when she accidentally discovered that someone was using Bryan's phone to set up a meeting with her mom at a gas station. Before she could wrap her head around it, Stewart suddenly attacked Sam and kidnapped Kim, carrying out a planned scheme to take her out of town. After grabbing Kim, Stewart took off, which led the police to show up and find Sam, who was alive but hurt. Things got tricky when Bryan got stuck in the elevator while the police waited downstairs to arrest him. But Bryan smartly found another way out, sneaking down without tipping off the officers. As Bryan got ready to leave in his car, a message from Kim popped up out of nowhere. That's when he realized that on the night Stewart showed up at his apartment, he secretly used Bryan's phone to set up a meeting with Lenore at the gas station. This ticked Bryan off. Without thinking twice, he sped toward Kim's location. Luckily, Bryan had put a tracker on his daughter's phone, letting him pinpoint where she was. Meanwhile, Stewart showed up at the runway as part of his carefully thought-out escape plan. His jet was ready to go, giving him the chance to avoid the fallout from what he'd done. But just at the last second, Bryan showed up. Even though Stewart's jet was already speeding down the runway, Bryan did everything he could to stop it. In a panic, Stewart used Kim as a bargaining chip, hoping Bryan would let him go and let him escape. To everyone's surprise, Kim managed to break free from Stewart's hold. Bryan, burning with anger, got ready to pull his gun. But he realized that shooting would land him in serious trouble. Bryan held back at the last second, choosing to take a smarter route. In the end, Bryan chose not to shoot Stewart. Still deep down, he promised himself that if Stewart ever got away with what he did, he wouldn't think twice about taking matters into his own hands. He was determined to make sure Stewart faced the consequences for his actions, no matter what. At the end of the story, Bryan had a heart-to-heart with Kim about her pregnancy. As a dad, he truly supported every choice that Kim and her partner made. In a touching moment, Kim shared her wish to name her baby after her late mother if it was a girl, as a beautiful tribute of respect and love.